Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second series of lectures, second episode in our series of lectures in our Tyneside Irish Brigade project. This is the Tyneside Irish Cultural Society, as you'll know if you've joined us anyway. And our guest tonight is Professor James McConnel, good friend of ours from Northumbria University here in the fine city of Newcastle. And James will take you through the talk for about a half an hour, after which you'll have plenty of time to make a contribution or ask a question. At the moment, your video and audio will be switched off, but you'll be able to join in later. You'll be able to re-engage. Also, if you want to send a question or type the question in, put it on in advance, that's great. Will give us something to think about. And without further ado, I just say a warm welcome to James McConnel. Thank you, James, for being with us tonight.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen with the title slide. Is that right, Tony? I'll take that as yes. Well, thanks to Tony, Barbara, Carol, and the Tyneside Irish Cultural Society for the invitation. I've spoken at the centre many times over the years, and I've always appreciated the opportunity to talk about Irish history to such an interested and well-informed audience. So in early January 1915, recruiting for the Tyneside Irish Brigade, the TIB, as I'll refer to it here, was near completion. Felix Lavery, a leading pre-war United Irish League of Great Britain, UILGB member in Newcastle, who'd been associated with efforts to raise a Tyneside Irish unit from the very beginning, sent a telegram to the Freeman's Journal newspaper, the Dublin mouthpiece of the Irish Parliamentary Party. And it stated, the completion of this brigade of United Irish men represents a record of work done that has no parallel in English history. This wonderful work is directly attributable to the prescience and patient attitude of our far-seeing and revered leader, Mr. John Redmond. In my talk this evening, I want to look at the recruitment and public image of the TIB in relation to these kinds of assertions about its ethnic and political Irishness. The main focus of my paper will be that while the local Irish diaspora, the local Irish community on Tyneside, was instrumental in recruiting men in late 1914 and early 1915, how the TIB was seen more widely was shaped more by Irish political nationalists and the British Army. So in putting this talk together, I have drawn inevitably on John Sheen's important 1998 work about the TIB, as well as Steve Shannon's valuable 2013 PhD about Irish nationalist organisations in the northeast of England, which I co-supervised. Sheen's book covers the mechanics of recruiting, training, deployment, and the battlefield experiences in detail and from the perspective of a military history. Steve's thesis, freely available online, if you want to read it, which I would recommend, will be of interest to anyone who wants to understand how the TIB fits into a longer and broader tradition of Irish organising on Tyneside. Now, I'm flagging these now partly to acknowledge my debt to these authors, but also because my focus here will be on the politics and the kind of public image of the TIB. So if you're interested in other aspects, particularly the military aspects or the wider Irish context, then I'd recommend consulting these two publications. So on August the 3rd, 1914, the day before the start of the First World War, John Redmond, pictured here, leader of the nationalist Irish Parliamentary Party, made an important speech in the House of Commons in which he signalled his broad support for the British war effort by calling on nationalists and unionists to combine to defend Ireland's shores against possible German attack. He did not, and at this point he could not, arguably, endorse Irish enlistment in the British Army, because the Home Rule Bill, which promised to give Ireland a form of devolved government, of devolution as we would now understand it, had yet to be passed into law. Nonetheless, his supportive statement on the 3rd of August in the House of Commons was very positively received in the period between the beginning of August and early September. The impact of Redmond's 3rd August speech, which in retrospect seems fairly modest, but it makes sense, the impact makes sense when we remember that Irish Home Rule politicians had been largely estranged from the British Army since at least the 1880s. Although significant numbers of Irishmen continue to take the so-called King's Shilling or the Saxon Shilling in the decades before 1914, Home Rulers tended to present this enlistment partly as a consequence of British misgovernment and economic mismanagement of Ireland, and also as a natural result, as they saw it, of the martial instincts inherent to Irishmen. Moderate Home Rule nationalists tended to avoid the more hard-line stance adopted by advanced nationalists during and after the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, which had depicted Irishmen who wore the so-called red livery of shame, the scarlet uniform of the British Army, as paid mercenaries or indeed as traitors to Ireland. In this context, Redmond's friendly stance in early August was welcomed across the British political spectrum because it was seen to be so much in contrast, particularly to the sort of pro-Boer, anti sort of British Army stance associated with nationalism from the Boer War period, and indeed there's an image in the slide showing a kind of a demonstration or riot relating to pro-Boer sentiment during the Boer War. The decision to pass Home Rule prompted Redmond to endorse Irish nationalist enlistment in the British Army on the 15th of September 1914. This was part of the background to the holding of a series of private meetings by Irish nationalists in Newcastle to consider how the Irish community in the city and the region might make a conspicuous contribution to the war effort. According to Joseph Keating, the Welsh-Irish writer and brother of a Redmondite Irish Party MP, the first meeting was held in the second week of September 1914 in the National Club, attended by a group of Irishmen, quote, representing both the advanced guard of bygone days and modern political power. Although apparently some expressed misgivings at this meeting about Irishmen joining up, others, whom Steve Shannon describes as more astute and more politically flexible, believed that the uncontrolled enlistment of the Irish of the region into the British Army might better be harnessed for Irish political purposes. As Keating reported the discussion, this viewpoint was, as he put it, there'll be nothing to prove the contribution of the Tyneside Irish if our fellows are mixed up with British regiments. So this meeting prompted a letter, and I'm sure a number of the people who are listening this evening will be familiar with this part of the history and what I'm saying in this lecture. So the meeting prompted a letter to the press on the 12th of September, calling for the formation of a specific Irish unit recruited in the Northeast, and inviting, as they put it, every representative Irishman on Tyneside, regardless of politics or religion, to attend a meeting on 13th September. Steve Shannon argues that this initiative was taken without consulting Redmond or the leader of the UILGB, the sort of the grassroots British Irish nationalist organisation, the UILGB, its leader T.P. O'Connor. And given the fact that the initial meetings in the National Club and the public letter of 12th September preceded Redmond's declaration in favour of Irish enlistment on the 15th of September, this is probably true and unsurprising that they wouldn't have consulted Redmond and T.P. O'Connor. The 13th of September meeting simply confirmed that there was broad-based support for the proposal amongst local Irish nationalists and unionists. It also appointed a committee under the chairmanship of the veteran Tyneside Irish nationalist Peter Bradley. I'm assuming that so Clayton Street here, this picture of Clayton Street in about 1912 is where the Collingwood Hall, which is where the Irish National Club was located at the time. The subsequent rejection of the committee's offer by the War Office on the 18th of September was later attributed by T.P. O'Connor to, as he put it, the ancient traditions of the old and professional army. There can be no doubt that the War Office and the military were traditionally hostile to Home Rule, stemming in large part from the bitterness surrounding the Boer War that I mentioned earlier. But the military establishment was also extremely concerned about the quality of many of the improvised military formations that were emerging across the UK at this time, not just in Ireland, but right across the United Kingdom. They were concerned about their military effectiveness. This same combination of prejudice and suspicion of sort of military amateurism was also encountered by John Redmond when he sought to channel Irish nationalists in Ireland into the 16th Irish Division. Shannon notes that the suggestion made after the committee were rebuffed by the War Office that the existing recruits or men who had indicated they would be willing to serve in a Tyneside Irish unit, the suggestion that they might be funneled to Irish battalions in Ireland was at this point firmly rejected. Shannon sees this as evidence that the committee remained committed to form a Tyneside-based Irish unit, rather than just servicing Irish battalions in Ireland. Whether there was any tension between these grassroots organisers on Tyneside and the leadership of the Irish Party at Westminster over this matter is unclear, but it does suggest that there may have been some differences in terms of priorities between them. Between the Tyneside Irish and the Irish Party. From the Irish Party's point of view, Redmond and O'Connor were very keen to highlight the enlistment of the Irish in Britain and indeed the Dominions and around the world to bolster their claims about nationalist Ireland's overall contribution to the war effort. There was a sense in which, the number of men volunteering was seen as a crude but really powerful measurement of commitment, and given Ireland's earlier history in terms of opposing British sort of foreign adventures, imperial wars, and now Redmond's commitment to the War of Nationalist Ireland, it was seen as a way of measuring how far Ireland was behind Mr. Redmond. Like the initiators of a local Irish unit on Tyneside, Redmond and the IPP leadership saw the enlistment of Irishmen or men of Irish descent into non-Irish units as much less helpful than enlistment in so-called green flag units, by which we mean units that were titled or uniformed or badged or flagged and so on in recognisably Irish ways, such as featuring the colour green or recognisably Irish symbols, shamrocks, sort of harps, etc. Pro-war nationalists were anxious to demonstrate their contribution in comparison to Ulster loyalists, who were joining the 36th Ulster Division, and in order to impress British politicians and Irish American opinion. Although a measure of Home Rule, as we've seen, had been passed in mid-September 1914, it had been suspended for the duration of the war, however long that was. And uncertainties about the post-war settlement of the Irish question in relation to the status of Ulster meant that pro-war nationalists wanted to present their contribution to the war in the most positive and kind of legible, the clearest way, the clearest light possible. And having Irish units, sort of with Irish nationalist volunteers and recognisably badged, etc., as Irish, was seen to be one of the most effective ways Irish pro-war nationalists felt of indicating their contribution. In the autumn and winter of 1914, Redmond and T.P. O'Connor first lobbied the War Office that Irishmen in England should be allowed to enlist with the 16th Irish Division, so that if you were wanting to join up in, whether it was Birmingham or Liverpool or Glasgow or Newcastle, that you should be allowed to volunteer for the Irish Division, which had become the focus of Irish nationalist recruiting efforts. The sluggish nature of Irish recruiting in the autumn of 1914 prompted the leadership of the Irish Party to then propose to the War Office in November 1914 that the TIB be transferred wholesale to the 16th Division in Ireland to make up its numbers. As Redmond explained to the commanding officer of the 16th Division, General Parsons, these battalions are recruited, he said, from the very best type of men. There is an utter absence in them of the corner boy element, and my information is that they are extremely anxious to be attached to the Irish Division. At this point, it's perhaps worth briefly reviewing what we know about the backgrounds of the men who enlisted with the Tyneside Irish Brigade. Sheehan noted that, as he put it, many men just wanted to join the army. Some were not particular which regiment they joined, whereas others were to join the Tyneside Irish for the sole reason, he said, that they worked with an Irishman who was joining the Tyneside Irish Brigade. He quoted one man who enlisted, who remembered that, "I could have joined the Durhams, but my father was Irish and there was any amount to pick from. Yet there were more English than Irish in the battalion as I remember." This man was an example of what one TIB officer described as the Irish in the English meaning of the word. Sheehan noted that many relatives that he spoke to confirmed that their ancestor was in fact second or third generation Irish. Indeed, a 2015 analysis by a former Northumbria history student, Ryan Holmes, of an admittedly small sample of men from the TIB who expressed their willingness to enlist, found that when the nativity at the place of birth of even just paternal grandparents was factored in, the proportion of Irish volunteers grew significantly. As recent research has suggested, to define as Irish only those who had themselves been born or whose parents had been born in Ireland is to define Irishness in very narrow ways, which don't necessarily reflect the kind of lived experience of Irish communities in the 19th and 20th centuries. Whatever the precise nature of the ethnic makeup of the TIB, Redmond's efforts of late 1914 to persuade the CO of the 16th Irish Division failed. Redmond already had a difficult relationship with Parsons, and the letter responded, and in the letter, and Parsons responded to the proposal to incorporate the TIB into the 16th unenthusiastically. He said, "I am not keen on getting the Tyneside battalions. The men may be good, but I fear that the officers are elected by the men or by committees." And this reflected this professional soldiers' fear and dislike of what they perceived to be amateurism. Parsons was not against Irishmen then in England joining the 16th, but he did not want units like the TIB transferring wholesale. Parsons' opposition to the TIB being transferred, along with the hostility of the War Office and the lack of enthusiasm of the TIB organisers themselves, seems to have frustrated Redmond and O'Connor's efforts. The evidence suggests then that the Irish nationalists on Tyneside behind the initial September 1914 attempt to form a Tyneside Irish unit were as anxious that the Irish on Tyneside not be subsumed into an Irish-based unit of the British Army as they were about the Irish being lost sight of within the Northumberland Fusiliers, the DLI, or other northeastern regiments. Notwithstanding then some apparent differences between Irish nationalists on Tyneside and the leadership of the Irish Party, both wanted to ensure that Irish nationalists got the credit for their contribution to the British Army. It's important to note, though, that the eventual formation of the TIB was a separate initiative from that of Tyneside nationalists in September 1914. Writing in 1917, T.P. O'Connor tried to present the eventual decision of the War Office to sanction the formation of a Tyneside Irish battalion, as it initially was, to the support of Joseph Cowan and a variety of Irishmen on Tyneside. In fact, as we know, the intervention of Newcastle's Lord Mayor, the Ulster Protestant Unionist, Johnston Wallace, pictured here, seems to have been the decisive factor in persuading the authorities to reverse their earlier rejection of an Irish unit on Tyneside. After all, as Shannon has described Johnston, he presented a more acceptable face to the War Office. Johnston seems to have been acting independently of the earlier initiative when he privately broached the matter with the then Lord Chancellor, Lord Haldane, on the 10th of October 1914, following Haldane's attendance at a recruiting meeting in Newcastle. It was only after this conversation that Johnston sought to mobilise local Irish nationalists. A private meeting in the Lord Mayor's chambers was held on the 14th of October, and this resulted in a public meeting on the 17th of October to form an organising committee and establish a Tyneside Irish battalion. At this meeting, Redmond's support for the war was certainly invoked, as was his call for all Irishmen to work together. The more ecumenical nature of the successful October initiative is important when thinking about the politics of the TIB. There's no doubt that the pro-war elements of John Redmond's Irish Party were mobilised in favour of the Tyneside Irish Battalion. T.P. O'Connor attended a large recruiting meeting on the 31st of October 1914 in Newcastle. That he spoke alongside Lord Donoughmore, an Irish peer, Tory politician and Grand Master of the Irish Orange Lodge, was significant, though. During November 1914, several pro-war Irish nationalist MPs also spoke on Tyneside in favour of the battalion. These MPs were amongst the most Redmondite of nationalist MPs. As the Kerry MP, J.P. Boland, pictured at the top, put it, let them share in the losses and the honour of the empire. That said, some specifically Irish concerns did creep into the speech of the Connemara MP, William O'Malley, the brother-in-law of T.P. O'Connor, when he spoke at Bishop Auckland in November 1914. He noted that Irish service in the wartime British Army would mean that at the war's end, Ireland had, as he put it, a trained and armed volunteer force that would maintain and preserve the liberty of Ireland. Just to be clear, he saw a home rule army being one of the outcomes of Irish service in the British Army. So for some Irish nationalists, it wasn't simply about demonstrating Irish loyalty and appreciation for home rule. It was also an insurance policy for the end of the war in the event that Ulster Unionist opposition to home rule continued. The Bishop Auckland meeting closed with the audience singing the unofficial Irish national anthem at the time, God Save Ireland. Some of the Tyneside Irish nationalists who supported the TIB and recruited for it also employed some of the same rhetoric used by pro-war nationalists in Ireland. So in a recruiting speech in December 1914, Peter Bradley compared the TIB to the Irish Brigade of France. As Keating later put it, an Irish brigade of immortal fame fought for France in the 17th and 18th centuries, and again in 1870 in the fight against the Germans. Another Irish brigade fought for America in the 19th century. In both cases, those heroes were exiles of the descendants of exiles who had been driven from their native land by misrule. Bearing these strange elements in mind, he said, the raising of an Irish brigade on the Tyneside, a warlike body of splendid physique and traditional bravery, confessedly intended to fight on the side of England, is the phenomenon of 1,000 years, a miracle that deserves to be examined seriously. As Shannon points out, Redmond's IPP deputy, John Dillon, described the TIB as our men, and the UILGB's annual report described the brigade as the outstanding feature of the Irish rush to the colours. The TIB's links to the Irish Party can also be seen indirectly through the Esmond family. At the outbreak of war, 2 Esmonds were nationalist MPs under John Redmond, and they had various sons who served in the forces, including Second Lieutenant Geoffrey Esmond, who served with the 4th Tyneside Irish Battalion and was killed in October 1916. Another Esmond pictured here, Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Grattan Esmond, was the brother of one of the Irish nationalist MPs, and he commanded the 4th Battalion of the Tyneside Irish in 1914-15. Esmond had previously been inspector of the Wexford and Waterford Irish Volunteers in Ireland. There was also a link with an older form of nationalism in the person of Maurice O'Connell, a grandson of Daniel O'Connell, who served with the Tyneside Irish. Another Irish Home Ruler who served with the brigade was Major Hamilton Davy, a Protestant Home Ruler from Carrickfergus, who before the war was the editor of the Ulster Guardian newspaper and stood, in fact, as an Irish Parliamentary Party candidate against Sir Edward Carson, no less, at the 1918 general election. Nationalists also pointed out that Lieutenant Colonel Miles Emmett Byrne, a descendant of a famous United Islander of 1798, was commanding officer at the start of the war of the 1st Battalion. Such individuals in the Tyneside Irish Brigade doubtless did much to heighten the impression that it was an Irish and nationalist unit. Attempts to what might be called green the TIB in terms of its appearance were hampered from the outset. While the 4th Tyneside Irish Battalion had a green flag with a gold harp, which was the flag of the Irish Party, such symbols were the exception. This isn't to suggest that the Tyneside Irish didn't display a range of markers of Irishness. Early recruiting posters emphasised Irish generals, though these were all figures such as Kitchener who reflected the significant Anglo-Irish component of the British officer corps. Shannon also notes that some posters featured orange-coloured shamrocks, presumably indicative of the cross-community nature of the recruiting effort. The emblem of the new Tyneside Irish unit is also significant. It's pictured here. It used the Connaught Rangers harp with the wording changed to Tyneside Irish. That the harp was surmounted by a crown signified the loyal nature of the unit. All the existing Irish regiments that featured a harp on their badges also had a crown. By contrast, Redmond originally favoured a crownless Brian Boru harp as the badge of his 16th Irish Division. The provision of shamrock on St Patrick's Day in March 1915 was also a feature of the Tyneside Irish Brigade. However, this had been officially sanctioned since the Boer War in recognition of Irish gallantry in South Africa. That the brigade's band had Irish war pipes with their distinctive 2 drones was also not unusual amongst the pre-war Irish regiments. Likewise, the brigade's acquisition of a wolfhound mascot followed the precedent set by the Irish Guards as far back as 1902. Overall, while the public image of the TIB was certainly distinctively Irish, it was overwhelmingly a brand of Irishness that had already been authorised and sanctioned in the pre-war regular army, and so I would argue did not especially signify any particular link to Home Rule or John Redmond. Whereas pro-war Irish nationalists could have little direct influence on the army, they were free to present the Tyneside Irish Brigade as Irish and nationalist in their propaganda. In an article on the Tyneside Irish Brigade that appeared in the Freeman's Journal in January 1915, the pro-war Redmondite W.G. Fallon recounted the origins of the Tyneside Irish Brigade and asserted that it was echoing the famous Irish-American poem made up of Kellys and Burkes and Shays. The nationalist press in Ireland reported regularly throughout 1914 and 15 on the progress of the TIB. As the Freeman's Journal noted in November 1915, it said, "It is an all-Irish brigade throughout, officers, non-coms and men." Other Irish commentators wrote of the TIB as almost exclusively composed of Irishmen. Michael McDonagh was a London Irish parliamentary correspondent who's been described by one modern historian as having shaped the image of the Irish at war during the 20th century more than any other single writer. McDonagh published two pro-war nationalist books, The Irish at the Front in 1916, and the second one, The Irish on the Somme, pictured here on the left, in 1917. McDonagh was close to John Redmond, who wrote the introductions for both of his volumes, and indeed Redmond sent copies of the volumes to various senior British political, military and royal figures. Both books were very much intended to publicise the important contribution that Irish soldiers were making to the fighting at the front. In McDonagh's second book, he devoted a whole chapter to the Tyneside Irish. Whilst McDonagh's 1917 account of the TIB at the Somme noted that the men hailed from the, as he put it, workshops and offices of Newcastle and Sunderland, as well as the cabins of Donegal, all, he said, had sprung from the Irish race. As evidence of this, McDonagh claimed that the ardour and enthusiasm of the TIB caused it to get ahead of the units on both of its flanks on the 1st of July. Nonetheless, he claimed that they, and I quote, overthrew and trampled down the proud Prussian guards and relaxed the grip which Germany had held for 2 years on a part of France. And this kind of very positive spin on the disastrous first day of the Somme was indicative of how he approached Irish soldiers in the First World War in general, and the Tyneside Irish Brigade in particular. The most sustained example of pro-war nationalist propaganda featuring the TIB was also published in 1917, with an introduction by Redmond and with an essay about the Irish in Britain by T.P. O'Connor. Irish Heroes in the War was significant. It was a significant and high-profile effort to present the TIB as a nationalist unit, and there it is pictured in the middle. The centrepiece of the volume was a history of the TIB written by Joseph Keating in late 1915, which described the founding and recruiting of the brigade. In explaining the motives of the men who joined the TIB, Keating quoted an unnamed Tyneside Irishman who'd said, "When King George put his signature to Home Rule, the Irish chaps from the yards and the collieries about the place came rushing to join the army." Keating also claimed that T.P. O'Connor's Newcastle recruiting speech of October 1914 had, as he put it, put the hallmark of nationalism on the whole scheme and inspired confidence. And before midnight of that same date, 800 volunteers had joined the Tyneside Irish. So that gives you a sort of a flavour of Keating's sort of account of the Tyneside Irish. Despite the fact that the TIB had sustained terrible casualties at the Somme in July 1916, Keating's narrative did not include the story of the battle, since it had been written in late 1915. It featured a little more in the edited version of Keating's essay that was published along with O'Connor's earlier piece under the title of Great Irishmen in War and Politics in 1920, and you can see that on the far right. Once again, Keating wrote of the brigade as effectively Irish to a man, fighting, as he put it, for the eternal principles of liberty, justice and civilization, but also for the sake of Erin's beloved self. And he continued, their combination of steadiness and dash, gallantry and resource maintained the best traditions of the Irish fighting quality. However, by this time, Redmond had been dead for 2 years, and the party he had led had been obliterated at the December 1918 general election. Right, so in conclusion, as a historian of Ireland and the First World War, I think that the history of the Tyneside Irish Brigade is fascinating. It highlights the support offered by leading Irish nationalists on Tyneside for John Redmond's pro-war strategy, whilst also indicating that these men acted independently of the Irish Party in their determination to establish a Tyne-based unit rather than simply being a recruiting ground for Irish-based units. It also shows that the eventual realization of an Irish unit on Tyneside was a compromise, given that once the War Office had taken over responsibility for the brigade, it was controlled and directed by the British Army. The Tyneside Irish Committee seemed to have had a much easier time. They had much less difficulty in accepting this power relationship than Redmond did in relation to the 16th Irish Division. Finally, this talk has demonstrated that senior Irish nationalists developed a much greener image of the TIB than was present locally, where recruiting literature and meetings tended to stress much more the coming together of Irish nationalists and unionists to create a Tyneside Irish Brigade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. That was a fascinating and detailed description of the recruitment of the Tyneside Irish Brigade. And I'd like to thank you very much once more for a very erudite contribution. Welcome to everybody watching here with us. I have no notification of any questions, so I'll start with one myself. I've always wondered, James, whether the Battle of the Somme and the experience of the Tyneside Irish and the losses of the Tyneside Irish in the First World War really led to a diminution in the Irish presence in the Northeast. The Irish community never seemed to be so strong again as it had been in the late Victorian era. And to be honest, we're looking to mark the 150th anniversary of the founding of an Irish club in Newcastle this year, and we can see its growth in the late Victorian era, and trace it, of course, its influence in the First World War. But then the years after seem somewhat barren, and we don't see Irish political, Irish politics really start to feature in the life in the Northeast until the anti-partition campaigns of the 1940s, and later on the anti-internment campaigns of the 1970s. So did the Tyneside Irish Brigade mark the high point of the Irish on Tyneside?
I think that's a really interesting question. So I think there are a number of different strands to this. I think, in a sense, the Tyneside Irish Brigade was sort of punching above its weight. But I think that this was generally true of the Northeast in terms of the number of service battalions that it raised during the First World War. Initially, many of which were recruited in the Northeast. So I think that, in a sense, that we've already heard that the composition was not entirely Irish, but I think that the organisation, the recruitment, if not always the recruits, was very much an expression of the civic mindedness and the kind of sense of confidence of the Irish in Newcastle and more generally on Tyneside. So I think, in a sense, it may represent a high watermark, though I think it's a little bit misleading. I think that there's also the point that, which is a broader one, which is that I think that Newcastle didn't benefit from the kind of second wave of Irish migration in the interwar period in the 1930s in the way that places like London and Birmingham did. And so in that sense, I think that you've got sort of longer term sort of migration and demographic factors, which mean that I think that it's not simply down to the fact that so many Tyneside Irishmen died during the First World War. There's an element of truth to that, but I think there are also wider, broader kind of demographic patterns in terms of the kind of local population is not really being sort of renewed in the way that other centres of the kind of Irish diaspora in Britain sort of are. I think in terms of your point about politics, which is obviously one way of gauging the kind of or taking the pulse of the Irish community in Newcastle and the region. I think Steve Shannon's work is obviously, Steve is the expert here, but I think that there is a sense in which, I mean, he documents this at a local level, but that there is that shift from sort of green to red, that sort of, particularly with the end of the long history of home rule and the gaining of effective independence of the 26 counties, that political organisation amongst the Irish sort of, I think, diminished and changed, and that channeling, which isn't automatic and isn't immediate, but channeling into kind of centre, left of centre politics in the 1920s.
Okay, I'm just checking if we've got any questions or contributions. It's very unusual for us not to have. I mean, maybe we're floating too high, James. Maybe we're too highfalutin. So we'd be very, very glad to get a question from somebody or a contribution from somebody.
I think just to say, I mean, I think, when we originally talked about this talk, you've been talking about, the legacy and the sort of the memory of the Tyneside Irish Brigade, and I think part of there is obviously there's a veterans association and so on, and I think you're much more familiar with that than I am, Tony. But I think perhaps the changing sort of nature of the Irish community in Newcastle and Tyneside, possibly also was a factor in the kind of the sort of the dimming of that history, the diminution of that sort of memory and legacy, and I guess also why we remember. It's sort of we kind of assume now, particularly after the centenary of the First World War, that everybody was very keen to remember the First World War in the decades that followed. But whilst there were obviously enormous efforts in terms of erecting sort of monuments, both on the battlefields but also at home, there are individual monuments. At Northumbria, there's the old Trinity Presbyterian Church, which is now part of the university, one of the university's buildings, but it's got a stained glass window to a chap who died with the Royal Flying Corps. And I remember looking at this, and one man is on about 5 or 6 different sort of war memorials in his old Northumberland Golf Club, in the local library in Gosforth, in the church, etc., in Newcastle University. So clearly there is, and in a sense, it's interesting. You have that sense of what happened to the National Club after the First World War, but because there has to be somewhere physically for war memorials to be located, and someone has to keep the memory alive.
Well, we've got a question now. Thank you very much for our question. I did have a question, yes. Anyway,
I can see it.
You can see it, yes. It's about the Pals Battalions and how did the Pals Battalions influence
affect recruitment into the Tyneside Irish.
Yeah.
I think, all I would say is we heard earlier on, I quoted one of the men, the veterans, their memories in John Sheehan's book. And Sheehan's book is particularly valuable, I think, because of when it was written. He was able to speak to, he knew and interviewed men who are all dead now, and so that's unique. But one of the quotations I gave was about a man who joined, I think, the Tyneside Irish, and he had a choice. He could have chosen the DLI, but his dad was Irish. I think in the very sort of sort of disorganized state in which the recruiting authorities at the beginning of the war were overwhelmed, and there wasn't the equipment, there wasn't there wasn't anywhere to sort of train or billet the men. So I think my sense, though I could be wrong and I'm prepared to be contradicted, my sense is that I don't think it made a huge amount of difference. So I think that, I mean, one of the things that did alarm the kind of sponsors of the Tyneside Irish, battalion in September, the initial sort of group, that they were concerned that Irishmen were just joining up willy-nilly. And this is true of Ireland as well. John Redmond and the Irish Party in Ireland are concerned about this, that, the enthusiasm is leading Irishmen to join up with lots and lots of different units. And thereby the nationalists are losing the credit because these people are, Irishmen are joining up in Highland regiments and they're thereby being dressed in kilts. They're joining English regiments. They're being lost sight of. Their Irishness is being lost sight of. So I think insofar as I think that was what was motivating the Tyneside Irish sort of battalion sponsors. But I don't have a sense particularly, beyond the fact that, I mean, there was obviously a keen competition between the Tyneside Irish and the Tyneside Scottish. I mean, a very friendly, I think, competition. But I mean, it goes to show this was before really, the kind of understanding of the attritional war of position, the sort of trench warfare of late 1914, early 1915. There was almost a sort of sporting sort of sense of competition between the Tyneside Irish and the Tyneside Scottish as to who would get the more men, as if recruits, as if that was the sort of the be all and end all. I think that there is that sense of enthusiasm and naivety that is indicative of certainly elements of the kind of early war mentality.
Thank you. Yes, just to say, James, the Tyneside Scottish does still exist, and we look forward to seeing the lads again in the Irish Centre in November.
Well,
and
I think what's interesting,
we'll be ordering a few drams in for them.
It's interesting that there was a pre-war effort, as there was with the Tyneside Scottish, to wear kilts, because kilts were a kind of in 1914 a globally recognised symbol of Scottish sort of military prowess. Which was seemingly sort of bequeathed to whoever wore them, however far from the Highlands they'd been born. And indeed, various Dominion units, the South Africans and the Canadians send kilted units to fight on the Western Front. And so there was, I think, that the Tyneside Scots were also quite keen, but were not allowed to have the kilt.
Sorry.
No.
Well, we've got a question from Johnny Doyle that will could keep us all night, and it's taking us a little bit past our subject matter for tonight. But Johnny Doyle asks, did any of the veterans of the Tyneside Irish Brigade become involved in the War of Independence? Well, oh yes, they did. James will tell you a little bit more, Johnny.
I think I would probably defer here to Tony. My sense is, I mean, obviously, it's a fascinating topic, but one that's received more attention in recent years. I mean, it's similar to the kind of the high profile. The Irish on Tyneside were not the largest sort of Irish community in Britain, but they produced the Tyneside Irish Brigade, which was unique in terms of Irish service battalions. In Britain, and likewise the level of activity on Tyneside after the war, during the War of Independence, sort of 1919 to 21, again is disproportionate in relation to the Irish population, and sees much more sustained activity on the part of the Tyneside sort of IRA in terms of attacks on buildings and the burning of various
burning
sites.
The airport down.
Yeah. So, my sense to the answer to the question is yes, Robert. sorry, who was asking the question?
Johnny Doyle.
Johnny, but I think that, I don't have that chapter and verse. I certainly know there's been some interesting work recently looking at former British soldiers, Irishmen, who joined the IRA in Ireland, and I would have thought that there may have been some, given that it was a volunteer force with very little in the way of military training. Certainly, the IRA in Ireland. It felt ambivalent about Irishmen who'd served in the British Army, but it also valued their military training and their knowledge of the enemy as it was. And I would imagine that may have been true of the IRA on Tyneside as well.
I'll just refer to one well-known example of this, James, and then probably it's time for your closing remarks. The interesting example is a guy called Gilbert Barrington, who came from Blackburn in Lancashire, who was a school teacher at St. Bede's School in South Shields, right in the middle of South Shields there, and he joined the he was put away in the War of Independence originally for being in the Tyneside IRA. He was lodged in Parkhurst jail, and when the treaty was signed, Michael Collins and co. got him released. He then promptly went over to Dublin and joined in the Civil War, fighting against Collins. And meanwhile, when he was released from Parkhurst, he went back to South Shields, and we've got the records of the governor's meeting at St. Bede's Church, at St. Bede's School, when he went back and said, I'm sorry, I've been away in Parkhurst jail for sedition. Could I have my job back? And the councillors and people on the governing board were very sympathetic to him, but the priest said, certainly not. And that's when he went off to Dublin. And then he didn't last long. Oh, he got a job with Shell Oil in Dublin, and he was captured by the Free State forces, and he was put in the Curragh. Now, he had more success with Shell Oil, and he went back to them after, and he said, where have you been? Can I have my job back? He said, yeah, where have you been? He said, I've been on the Curragh. I've been interned. And the Shell Oil man said, oh, yeah, active service, that's okay, start on Monday. At which point his wife wrote from South Shields and said, I'll come over from Dublin, but and we'll start again, but no more politics, please. And he went on to have a very successful business career, and we know a lot of stuff. He's left a lot of stuff in his memoirs, and we have it thanks to his descendants in the Genealogical Society in Dublin there. So Barrington and Malarkey, two very interesting examples from there. I think we've quite a lot of people saying yes. I think we're there. Thanks, everybody, congratulating you very much.
No.
James, we've 3 minutes left, and I've got to say our next lecture will be on Tuesday, the 15th of June, 7 o'clock, Family Life During the First World War by Chloe Peters from University College London. So we hope to see you back for that. And don't forget, tell your friends, this is available on our website because we've recorded the whole thing. Your closing remarks, James. Thank you.
Just to say thank you very much. The invitation prompted me to bring some thoughts I'd been having about the Tyneside Irish Brigade and my knowledge, and particularly around the kind of propaganda, Irish pro-war propaganda in relation to the Tyneside Irish. So it was, I enjoyed it, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
And thanks to our producers and our listeners.